Let's talk about what's going on in the cattle markets. Lots happening, supply, demand, prices, what's happening on ranches and feed yards, really across North America, and how that's impacting what is happening in the grocery store from a price perspective. Joining us here to break down the Q2 2024 report for beef out of Rabobank. It is Lance Zimmerman. He is Senior Animal Protein Analyst for North America. Hey, Lance, great to see you again.
Hello, great to see you, Shaun.
Yeah, last time we chatted, we were at CattleCon, I think, right?
We were.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were there in the chaos of Orlando, Florida. You know, ironically, then it was February, so we were going there to warm up. Now we're finally getting warm.
Yeah. The temperature dial needs to turn up here a little bit for some of this grass and some of the crops, depending on where you are. Okay, so overall, what do we know? What's our, I guess, the thing you're the most optimistic about versus the thing that concerns you the most?
yeah, I think as you look at the cattle and beef markets across the U.S. and Canada, we dive into this in the Global Beef Quarterly. What's interesting is our markets are some of the strongest on the globe right now. And we converted everything in the report to US dollars per kilogram. And it's pretty fascinating. Both the US and the Canadian markets are at basically $4 a kilogram, a little bit above that. While a lot of other major global beef producers around the globe, Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, their prices are trending lower. And so what we've seen develop over the course of the last 24 months is a differentiation in markets. What's going on in US and Canada is in a clear uptrend over that time, while a lot of the other global beef markets are in a downtrend. So the good news here as we look at it, we're seeing what continues to be exceptionally strong demand for beef across North America. It doesn't matter if it's Mexico, US, or Canada. Beef demand is holding up exceptionally well right now. And so that's the good news. The other side of that that's more challenging is I think as we look at the other end of the supply chain where boots are on the ground, where ranchers are, it's still pretty tough. The US is kind of trying to pull itself out of the drought that's been plaguing it for the last 3 years. Canada still very much so dealing with it, and Mexico's kind of a new entrant into it. And so as we look at it, we still have a lot of just basic, fundamental production challenges that are causing a lot of strife and challenges for producers today. We would love to get to a point where we talk about herd stabilization. I think that's going to be really challenging still in Canada, considering the current environment that's there. I think it's going to be easier in the US if we can get past some of the drought challenges. And then Mexico is probably going to go from a place of herd growth where they've been really the last several years and probably just hoping to kind of keep things steady here for the next 12 to 24 months as they kind of try to reel themselves out of some pretty tough drought conditions here lately.
So you mentioned that North America is a little bit of isolated here when it comes to, in comparison to Europe. Are we a laggard in that regard, or are we able to maintain these price levels?
I think right now we're going to be able to maintain these price levels. One of the things that's fascinating about beef consumers in North America is they're consuming the best quality of beef they ever have in their lifetimes. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about Canadian consumers eating Canadian grown beef, US consumers eating primarily US grown beef, or Mexico. All three national cow herds are producing some of the highest quality of beef they ever have before. And I think that that's really allowed beef on the plate to differentiate itself from the other animal proteins. Where 20 years ago we probably talked a lot more about substitution and trading down,
Yep.
and today I would tell you there's not as much of that substitution effect happening as long as consumer incomes hold up. And I think to your point, are we leading? Are we lagging? Are we differentiating ourselves from some of these other global markets? I think with each passing week, a lot of the macro level economists are gaining comfort around the idea that we don't necessarily have to go into a hardcore recession in North America. Where over the course of the last couple of years, I think the discussion was we're not in a recession yet, but man, the outlook for the next 6 months is awfully concerning. I think now we're starting to get to a place where we're all getting comfortable with that idea, right or wrong, that maybe we're in a place of just incredibly slow growth. And we're going to be challenged with stronger than normal inflation, stronger than what we became accustomed to interest rates. And that's going to put a damper on some things, maybe a little bit of some storm clouds on the horizon, but that the storm may never truly arrive. Or if it does, maybe it's just a couple rainy days and not a torrential downpour. And if that's the case, then I do think, as we look at, in particular, at our Canadian and U.S. beef markets, that these higher prices can be sustained for longer. And that's good news for all of the producers we work with every day, because it gives some confidence to the idea that maybe these market prices can hold up better longer. And that's really what we need to make the cattle producer whole again.
How is it impacting trade flows?
Yeah, trade flows, we're starting to see that shift happen. When you look at the U.S. right now in particular, certainly their exports are down. The three key markets there, uh, South Korea, China, Japan, all of those represent a 25% decline in volumes over the last 12 months. As we look at imports coming into the U.S., that's been good news. If you're a Canadian producer, excited about having an outlet for your particular markets. Right now, over the last 12 months, export or imports into the U.S. have been equally as strong as exports have been down, double-digit percentage growth in imports into the U.S. And as we look at some of those key markets, even if you just look at year-to-date import volumes, Canada's been a beneficiary of that. Australia's been a beneficiary of that. Even as you look at it, New Zealand, Brazil, Uruguay, all seen year-over-year growth in imports into the U.S. over the last 3 months or 4 months now. We got January through April data. Mexico's been the only one that's been a little bit softer, but I think that's just a short-term trend. Post elections in Mexico, we've seen the peso really weaken. There's going to be a big value proposition to draw more of those Mexican imports into the U.S. as that product with the exchange rate effect is going to be more affordable as well. And so
Well,
as we look at the trade flow, certainly it's a challenge having more expensive protein here in the U.S. and Canada, but the benefit to Canada is they have the U.S. market that's at such a supply deficit that they're able to feed into some of that.
that makes sense. You mentioned currency. I was going to, when you mentioned Japan and their purchasing being lower, like some of that has to be relative to just the weakness we've seen in the yen, right?
It is, yeah. There's certainly some of that. There's also, we got to keep in mind that there is always um, economic concerns in each one of those different countries and warehousing of proteins that happens and things of that nature and their own production dynamics. Certainly, that's the case when we talk about a country like China. And obviously, they're a much bigger consumer of pork and chicken there as well, just to where they are from an economic standpoint and what those production dynamics are doing. In addition to, how's food service acting? What are consumers willing to do? Are they going out to eat a lot? Another big part when we talk about Japan, let alone from currency dynamics and macroeconomic factors, is also what what are business travelers doing, and how does that influence a premium protein like beef, because it's a destination item. And so when we talk about those different factors, all of those are having some varying degree of influence as we think about those Asian markets that obviously Canada and US beef producers are so focused on right now.
Now, we've been talking a lot of real agriculture about what's happening with the HPAI, avian influenza related to dairy cattle.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, is that having I guess what impacts is that having relative to beef consumption? Like, this has been a hard. I continue to sort of track this and trace it, and as you put this report together, is that a factor at all at this point?
Yes and no. I would tell you the biggest factor that it has in a lot of these discussions right now, Shaun, is the idea of what are we doing from an animal health standpoint? What are we doing from an animal tracking standpoint so that we minimize the spread and impact of this virus within the cattle population? Right now, the great news is, as the virus stands today, um, the only way that virus is being transmitted from one cow to the other is through milking equipment and through animal handling, and some of those issues as it pertains to lactating dairy cattle. So that certainly minimizes the risk of spread into the beef industry. The other side of that discussion is, well, we do have a certain population of dairy cattle that get culled and could perhaps enter into the beef production system. I hope your listeners have a sense of humor, but I always joke that the lifetime achievement award of every dairy animal is to end up beef, right? Um,
Steak
but
sandwich,
in
baby.
Exactly, but in all seriousness, what's been fantastic is the government in the U.S. has taken a lot of responsibility in terms of trying to navigate, has this virus found its way into the supply chain? And in every step along the way, they've been able to demonstrate that that virus has not been a concern from a food safety standpoint. They evaluated ground beef samples at retail stores in states where high path avian influenza had been found and found no evidence of the virus in any retail ground beef samples. Then they went back to the packing plant level and said, let's look at cattle that inspectors identified from the onset as ineligible for slaughter because they showed some visible signs of illness. So they went to cattle that they'd already ruled ineligible to enter into the food supply and tested those cattle for evidence of the virus, particles of the virus. And they found, I think it was they tested over 100 of these cows, cull cows, that were already considered ineligible for the food chain. And actually, only one of those 100+ cows that they tested actually tested positive for virus particles. And so, again, none of those animals entered into the beef production system. And so the good news is the governments went out of their way, I think, and went above and beyond board to make sure that the food supply chain is safe. They've gotten those test results out into the public, and right now, I think there's been no hint at this impacting beef demand whatsoever. But that's not at all shocking because we've been dealing with high path avian influenza for over a decade, and this particular strain for over 2 years, and we've not necessarily seen it result in a fall off in broiler demand or
Right.
turkey meat demand.
Yeah.
We have seen some impacts on egg demand, but I would argue that that was more due to the fact that egg prices skyrocketed higher, and we actually did more harm to demand from a pricing impact than we really did any type of food safety concerns.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I want to finish up with something that really caught my eye that uh, feels quite concerning because it's hard to get your head wrapped around it. But talking about climate disclosures and how they've edged into beef supply
Yeah,
chains, and in particular, your concern over scope 3 emissions related to
yeah.
the beef sector. So, what exactly is going on here?
Yeah, and so you're referring to the feature article in this quarterly beef report that we do each quarter. We do a specific focus, and we had two of our sustainability analysts navigate this idea of climate disclosures, and they did a knockout job with this section of the paper, really talking about the tension that exists, not just in the beef industry, but I would tell you in all of agriculture, in that we have a variety of regulations and amendments and rulings that are being legislated at various levels of government around the globe. Um, Basically saying we need to have scope 3 understood, scope 2 and 1 understood better, and we need to be able to track those different measurements and understand what emissions are in all the different products we consume, from cars and trucks to the food we eat.
Mm.
And the problem is, as you get to production agriculture and you really are a food company needing to get an understanding of your scope 3 emissions, it means you have to bring the producer on board. And in some cases, the producer can navigate those discussions and give you some emission standards. But by and large, we're all still struggling through this together. I like to say we're all trying to fall forward together as we learn and make mistakes, and then we learn and we make mistakes. And with a lot of these commitments coming down the road in the next few years, we're still not at a place we can get there. And so the good news is in the US, the SEC actually walked back and said, hey, we don't need your scope 3 emissions. help us understand in your public documents for a publicly traded company your scope 1 and 2, because you can control those. You have a handle on those. And what we're starting to see is if over the last 10 years was a period of great recognition of needing to get an understanding of what our emissions factors are, maybe these next 10 years are the great reevaluation of understanding what emissions factors are for different nodes of production, not just throughout the food system, but in all various forms of production and distribution and consumption. And so the paper talks about those challenges that exist and layers in some pragmatic approaches that beef producers, cattle producers, processors, and the like can kind of wrestle with in unison, so that hopefully over the next 5 to 10 years, we can be more practical and maybe a little bit less pie in the sky about achieving some of these ideal targets that we've set, and that we can work together and find some very pragmatic ways to address this issue going forward. Because I think we all want to get better. We all want to measure these things. We all want to do what's right for the consumer, what's right for the planet, and likewise, I think agriculture producers get it. We wouldn't be in business if we didn't, but we got to do it in a way that makes business sense for all of us.
Lance, what's the probability that, 3 years from now, we're talking about an expansion of production? Is that actually possible in Canada and the US based on some, as you put all these puzzle pieces together?
Yeah, I think as we look at it, we are, I think, going to go through in the next 3 years a rebuilding on the cattle and beef side, getting the cow herd built back up again. I think the $1 million question is what ultimately levels do we build back to? Is it back to the prior bump that we all had in cattle numbers? Now we're sitting here about 7, 8 years ago, right? Um, Probably not going to get back to those levels because again, we're sitting here. If you look at Canada carcass weights, if you look at US carcass weights, they're almost shockingly high. We saw carcass weights over 1,000 pounds in Canada at their peak. In the US, instead of seeing weights decline through May and June, they've held steady through the second quarter, which is just absurd. You just never see that seasonally. And so we're going to replace some cows with production efficiency, with additional carcass weight. Um, we need Mother Nature to get out of our way. We need some rain again, and that's the challenging situation we're in. It's volatile times. We talked about this in Orlando, and so we need to find a way to get some resiliency back in all of our supply segments, some confidence back in processing, some confidence back in cattle feeding, and that trickles all the way down to the cow calf producer. So I think to get it done, we're going to need to see these higher prices sustained for longer. And if we can do that, then I think we'll be talking a couple of years from now about a really robust recovery to numbers in the countryside.
Yeah, robust supply recovery and robust profits. Those we would
Go
be.
hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Lance, thanks for joining us here. Really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shaun.